the time, it was the worst crash in aviation history.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation.
In 1974, more than 300 people died when their plane fell from the sky.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
You couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being.
The key to understanding the disaster is found thousands of kilometers away. An unusual piece of evidence that tells the troubling story of a crash that could have been prevented.
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 12th, 1972. One of the newest members of American Airlines fleet is in Detroit, Michigan.
John, Paige.
Flight 96, a brand new DC-10, is getting ready for takeoff. Captain Bryce McCormick and co-pilot Paige Whitney have been in the plane for hours.
Back there, so when we're in flight, if you can get a chance just to look at that.
Detroit is just a stopover on a flight from LA to Buffalo and then to New York.
You got there? You ready to try one, Paige?
All right, sir.
McCormick has flown the plane out from California, but Whitney is going to fly the next leg. Both men want as much time at the controls as possible. Neither one of them has more than 75 hours flying the DC-10. Few pilots have more. There simply aren't enough of the planes in the air. In 1972, the DC-10 had just been introduced. The plane is the latest advance to passenger jets. Its style and its size set it apart from other airliners. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation has spent more than $1 billion developing it.
In the late 60s, there was a race going among the three major manufacturers of jetliners, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed, to see who could get the first jumbo out. So they got really busy on getting this DC-10 into production as fast as they could. And one of the things that they could not suffer were many delays based on some problem with the design.
American Airlines is one of the first companies to buy the plane. Flight 96 is one of those planes. Just the 5th DC-10 ever built. Cydia Smith has just been trained to be the chief flight attendant on the DC-10.
I was excited because it was one of the first jumbos that we had. And I was going to have the opportunity to fly number 1, which is what I always wanted to do on a big jet.
Okay, you got it? Hand on the wheel. I got you. V1, rotate.
Just after 7 in the evening, Flight 96 lifts off from Detroit Airport. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is rising easily through 3,500 meters over Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I was sitting in my seat, and the captain had turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, and I was making my way to the galley, and I had to go sort of downhill because we were climbing to go to the galley to turn on the coffee. when I punched the coffee and I moved over to one side, that's when it happened. I remember falling over because the plane was like this, but all of a sudden it just went like this. I saw ceiling compartments fall, and I saw things coming out of pockets and everything, and I thought to myself, oh boy. It felt like the last day of my life.
We hit something. We lost an engine here.
In the cockpit, the crew is fighting for control of their jet. The throttles which control the 3 engines have snapped to idle. The plane loses almost all its thrust. The huge jet begins slowing down.
The plane immediately took a huge drop. And the next thing that happened was I was hit in the face with a piece of the plane. My husband was frantically trying to find a stewardess to give me something to put a pressure on my face to stop the bleeding.
Let me have it!
McCormick takes over control of the plane. He and Whitney wrestle the jet level. But Flight 96 has been badly damaged.
Have we got hydraulics?
No, I've got full rudder here.
The rudder on the tail, which controls the direction of the jet, is jammed to the right. That's forcing the plane to swing dramatically in that direction. While McCormick fights to turn his damaged plane back to Detroit, Cydia Smith is shocked to see a gaping hole in the floor of the main passenger cabin.
People were asking me, what to do, and I knew that I didn't know what to tell them.
Smith has been able to account for all of her passengers. But flight attendant Sandra McConnell is missing.
Sandra! Can you hear me? Sandra, where are you?
And finally, I saw her come out of one of the bathrooms.
McConnell has to cross the hole in the floor to move to safety.
And almost every step she took, the floor kept collapsing.
The crew brings up power to the engines on the wings. But the third engine on the tail stubbornly refuses to respond.
Center, this is American Airlines Flight 96. We got an emergency.
American 96, roger. Type of emergency?
We've got a jammed rudder. We need to get down and make an approach.
Along with his engine and his rudder, McCormick is also having trouble controlling the elevators on the tail of the plane. They help him move the massive plane up and down. They're slow to respond, but he can move them. The situation isn't completely hopeless.
I think it's going to fly!
American 96, turn further right, heading 200.
Without complete control of the elevators, and with a rudder that's frozen to the right, McCormick has to use his engines to turn the plane. By increasing the thrust on one side of the plane, he can change direction. But it won't be fast.
I have no rudder control whatsoever. So our turns are going to have to be very slow and cautious.
All of the passengers move as far away from the hole in the back as possible. But apart from the cut to Loretta Kaminsky, so far there are no other serious injuries.
Captain, there's a hole in the back of the plane.
A hole?
Yes, sir. What do you want us to do?
Get everyone ready
For an emergency emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick's DC-10 is badly damaged. The lives of everyone on board now depend entirely on his ability to land a plane that can barely fly. With explosive suddenness, a short flight from Detroit to Buffalo has become the most challenging flight of Captain Bryce McCormick's career. He's down an engine, and he can't move his rudder. As he heads back to Detroit, McCormick begins to slow his plane down so it can land safely. But when he does, his plane begins falling dangerously fast. Ideally, McCormick should be descending at 700 feet a minute. But now he's falling more than twice that fast. 1,600 feet per minute.
What's the sink rate?
Sink rate, 1,600!
At this rate, McCormick will crash well short of the runway. He increases power to his engines to slow his fall.
Sink rate, 700.
McCormick has slowed the plane's descent to 700 feet per minute. But to do that, he's had to increase his forward airspeed, which means he'll be landing far faster than usual. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, McCormick talks to the passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We've had a small problem, but the plane is under control now, and we're heading back to Detroit for an emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick was as calm as if he were welcoming you on the plane.
As the plane nears the airport, flight attendants ask passengers to remove their shoes and any sharp pieces of jewelry.
They had to take off their shoes and glasses. We collected everything in a blanket.
Less than half an hour after leaving, the badly damaged DC-10 struggles back to the Detroit airport.
The few minutes that it took to get back to Detroit were the longest minutes that I will ever remember spending on an airplane, because we were sure that we were not going to survive.
Captain Bryce McCormick now needs to give the jet even more power to push the nose up for landing. His plane is still drifting to the right and traveling fast.
I have no rudder to straighten it out when it hits.
The DC-10 with 67 people aboard roars toward the runway at almost 300 kilometers an hour.
The landing was the most frightening part of the entire flight.
When the plane hits the ground, it begins veering hard to the right.
Once the plane landed, it seemed like we just went on forever. I mean, it was just forever.
One set of landing gear wheels runs off the runway and through the grass. After a harrowing touchdown, the plane eventually comes to a stop just 300 meters from the end of the runway.
Okay. Engines off at your discretion.
Shut him down.
Every woman wanted to hug him, and he was just amazing, because it was just at that moment that we all realized that we were alive because of him, that he literally had saved our lives.
If you take a look at something like this and you say, well, there's good flying and there's bad flying, this is beyond good. This is superlative. This is using every instinct you have as an airman and all the capabilities you have to stay calm enough to get the situation assessed.
With the plane on the ground, the crew has its first opportunity to inspect the damage.
The captain and I walked back when everybody was off. We walked back to the back, and we just looked up and saw this hole. And it was just so weird.
There's no indication that the jet hit something as the pilots first thought. What has caused such damage to the airliner?
The hole was so enormous that if anyone had been sitting in the seats that were there, they would have been sucked out immediately. At that point, they still felt it might have been a bomb.
But while the incident had happened with explosive suddenness, no indication of a bomb is found. As investigators begin their work, they discover that not all of the DC-10 is at the Detroit airport. A coffin that the plane was carrying in its cargo hold is discovered 30 kilometers away from the Detroit airport, near Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Investigators also find the plane's rear cargo door.
Doors are not supposed to fall off airplanes, especially since it was a rather new airplane. You would not expect something like that to happen.
When they examine the cargo area of the plane, they discover that the very design of the door makes it a potential weak spot. Most doors on a jet open inward. In fact, the door is slightly larger than the frame it fits into. As the pressure builds inside a jet, this type of plug door is actually forced into the frame of the aircraft. The design makes the door extremely safe. But McDonnell Douglas designed the cargo door on the DC-10 to open outward. That decision was made to increase the amount of storage space on the plane. When it's closed, hooks on the DC-10's door grab hold of a bar on the plane's doorframe. To make sure it's closed, baggage handlers push down on a lever, which drives locking pins through the hooks, which hold them in place. When investigators examine the cargo area of the plane, they don't find any structural damage around the door. When they study the locks on the cargo door itself, they find that the latches are not completely closed. And the pins that are supposed to make sure the door is locked are not in their locked position.
When we interrogated the cargo handler that closed the door, it became immediately apparent that he used excessive force to close the door. And in fact, he said he had to use his knee to get the door handle to go flush.
Investigators make a frightening discovery. It's possible to close the lever on the outside of the door, even if the hooks and locking pins are not in the closed position. Paul Eddy is a journalist who investigated the history of the DC-10.
What Windsor showed is that you could actually pull the handle in order to buckle the top fixture so that the handle went home properly, but the locking pins had not gone through the spools.
Engage the lever.
This means that baggage handlers can believe the door is closed when it's not. Not only can the outside lever be closed without the locks being fully engaged, there's no way for the crew of the plane to know. The faulty locking pins will still turn off the warning light, even though they aren't in their proper position. The door was a ticking time bomb. As passenger jets climb, the difference between the pressure inside the plane and the pressure outside the plane grows. If a door isn't properly shut, it will blow out with explosive force. The problem on the American Airlines flight began as the plane passed through 3,500 meters. When the door blew, the coffin in the cargo hold was sucked out. When the air pressure inside the plane was released, anything that wasn't firmly attached was pulled out of the airliner.
It's a really startling thing if you're not expecting it. What you've got is a lot of air stuffed inside this pressure vessel that now wants to get out. And the bigger the airplane is, the more powerful the hurricane of air leaving the airplane is during that period of time.
By itself, explosive decompression does not make a plane unflyable. So why had Captain McCormick experienced such difficulties controlling his jet? Investigators take a closer look at the back of the plane's cabin and learn that the very design of the DC-10 makes it vulnerable. When the cargo door blew off, there was so much pressure on the floor of the cabin that it collapsed into the cargo compartment below. When it did, the floor ripped into some of the plane's critical control systems.
When it collapsed the floor, it took the cables that controlled number 2 engine, and it took most of the cables, or impeded most of the cables that had to do with the flight controls in the back.
I think it's going to fly!
It left McCormick just enough control to keep his plane level. The remarkable flying of Bryce McCormick had saved the lives of everyone on board Flight 96. But there was a problem with one of the newest and most expensive planes flying over North America.
In the Windsor incident, there was an obvious flaw. And that's where the NTSB said, look, here is really the smoking gun, the ability to close that thing without having all those locks engaged. Let's make sure we change this system right now. Every DC-10 operator needs to know this.
I want everything checked. I want all the bolts checked first.
Chuck Miller is the head of the NTSB's Aviation Safety Bureau.
You have to check all the latches, okay? Every single latch.
It's his responsibility to point out problems with the new DC-10 and propose solutions. He helps write the fixes he thinks McDonnell Douglas needs to make to keep the plane safe.
He was a very, very professional man, and he had his investigators had enormous respect for him. Chuck didn't sit back in the office. Chuck was always on the scene.
For Chuck Miller, fixing the DC-10 is a matter of professional pride. For McDonnell Douglas, the near accident over Windsor has enormous implications. Their billion-dollar gamble came close to tumbling from the sky. If anything else goes wrong, the company itself could be at stake. March the 3rd, 1974. A perfect spring-like day in Paris. It's been almost 2 years since a DC-10 came close to crashing near Windsor, Ontario. Now more than 50 of the new planes are flying around the world. One of them, Plane 29, is owned by Turkish Airlines. Normally, the last leg of this trip from Turkey to England wouldn't be very crowded. But today, the DC-10 is filling up fast. People are squeezing into seats throughout the plane. A strike at a British airline has passengers scrambling for any flight back to London. Wendy Wheel is one of many last-minute additions to the flight. A model, she's returning home after a shoot in Spain.
We'd been married for 18 months, and we were about to start a family. I believe the secret of her success for modeling was not just that she was a very attractive girl and good model material, but she was generally liked by all the photographers because she had such a pleasing, lovely, light personality.
With all the new passengers boarding, the flight is a little behind schedule. And it's not only the crew who are waiting. At the back of the plane is baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi. With all the new passengers, he's not sure if there are any more bags to load.
C'est tout. Vous êtes fini. Bien, j'ai l'affaire.
Not expecting any other luggage, Mahmoudi locks the rear cargo door. The DC-10 is set to go. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, THY Flight 981 lifts off into the skies above Paris. London is less than an hour away.
Race control, this is Tango Hotel Yankee 981. We're at 60, requesting clearance to flight level 230.
Tango Hotel Yankee 981, you are cleared to flight level 230.
981, roger.
As it flies away from the airport, the DC-10 continues to gain altitude. 2,700 meters, 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. The huge jet shudders and banks to the left.
The cabin blew out! Are you sure?
Just 16 seconds after the start of the crisis, the crew struggles to save their crippled jet. The nose is pitching down, the plane picking up speed.
Bring it up! Come on, go! I can't bring it up! She doesn't respond!
Passengers at the back of the plane witness a horrifying scene. 2 rows of seats have simply disappeared. Through a huge hole in the floor, passengers can see the sky over France.
7,000 feet! Hydraulics! We've lost it!
The crew discovers that they have no hydraulic power with which to control the plane. Without it, they can't move their rudder or elevators. Even without its most basic controls, the plane begins to level out. But it's fallen too far.
Looks like we're going to hit the ground! Speed!
The DC-10 is traveling almost 800 kilometers an hour. The flight from Paris to London never even makes it to the English Channel. Just 9 minutes after taking off, Turkish Airways Flight 981 becomes the worst plane crash of all time. In London, the flight is listed as delayed. The news of the crash comes out slowly.
I went to the ticket office kiosk and I asked what has happened to the flight, and instantly the look on the gentleman's face behind the counter told me something was wrong, instantly.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
I looked on the television and I just thought, well, I just hope she's dead, because I just saw the carnage of the forest in Senlis, and it was like looking at a First World War trench movie.
Flight 981, carrying 346 passengers, virtually disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation. And the litter of personal possessions, electric wires, bits of metal, bits of bodies, just strewn everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being. I still have nightmares about this, even though it's 33 years ago.
Investigators for the French Accident Investigation Bureau are quickly on the scene.
My first job was to evaluate the scope of the wreckage and to begin the first investigation on the spot. At first, I was unable to know what has happened. I was just seeing that a terrible crash has occurred and that it will be a very hard work for the investigators.
Despite the enormous force of the crash, the black boxes, made of 3 layers of hardened steel and insulation, survive. Their contents could provide valuable clues about the crash.
Most of the speculation was that it must have been a bomb, because, you know, you've got a almost brand new, very powerful aeroplane flying in clear blue sky, and it gets to 12,000 feet and falls out of it.
Investigators are called to a field 15 kilometers from the crash site. They find a piece of fuselage and 2 rows of seats from the DC-10. Somehow, they fell free of the airliner before the rest of the plane smashed into the forest. When investigators arrive, the bodies of the passengers who were in the seats have already been removed. When relatives of those who died in the crash arrive in France, they're directed to a small church in the town of Senlis.
One of the saddest sights I've ever seen is in this church. They laid out on tables everything they'd found, you know, clothing, possessions, teddy bears, rings, watches. And then relatives who wanted to were allowed to come and walk around these trestle tables with all this stuff laid out.
They produced a little packet with my wife's wedding ring and rings, engagement ring. It was all pretty battered up, so you can imagine the thoughts that went through my mind.
Since the accident involves an American plane, the NTSB's Chuck Miller joins the investigation. For the second time in 2 years, he's dealing with a problem with the DC-10.
I don't believe that Miller suspected for one moment that the door hadn't been fixed after Windsor.
But it becomes clear that the piece of fuselage found in France is in fact the plane's rear cargo door. It seems like a repeat of the Windsor accident. Miller is left with a haunting question. Why hadn't the problem been fixed?
When he saw the door, of course, saw that it hadn't been done. The fix hadn't been made. And that's when I think his anger became very, very strong indeed.
Miller takes an unusual step. Although the official investigation is just beginning, he gives journalist Paul Eddy an important tip.
I said, have you got any ideas what made the door come off? He said, yeah. Well, if I were you, I'd go and look at a place called Windsor, Ontario.
Hello. I'm Chuck Miller.
Miller shares his suspicions with the French investigators.
Could you please pass these around? These were taken on June 12th, 1972, right after the incident.
We have asked for the report on the Windsor accident, and our American colleagues were also volunteers to give us a lot of details.
Now, we had an American Airlines flight from Detroit to Buffalo have its cargo door blow off.
And he has been very frank and had explained what he was thinking of the Windsor accident.
After all the work done during the American Airlines investigation, had something been overlooked? Was there another problem with McDonnell Douglas's enormous plane? With the information from Chuck Miller, French investigators take a closer look at the plane's cargo door. They make a shocking discovery. There is no new problem. It's just like the American Airlines case all over again. The latches that are supposed to hold the cargo door closed aren't locked. And since 2 rows of seats were sucked out of the DC-10 over Paris, it's clear that the floor on the plane collapsed, just as it had in Windsor.
It looks like we're going to hit the ground! I can't bring it up! Nothing we know!
In fact, when investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, they find that the Turkish flight crew had even less control of their plane than the crew of American Airlines Flight 96.
We need to get down and make an approach.
I think it's going to fly!
Over Windsor, Bryce McCormick was able to recover his plane and land it. But in Paris, all the hydraulic systems were destroyed.
We've lost it!
The hydraulic fluid helps crews move the rudder and elevators on the tail. Not being able to control them meant the crew couldn't keep their plane in the sky.
The basic problem was the Paris flight was much heavier in terms of the number of people on board. The floor, when it collapsed with such a tremendous amount of pressure that it literally severed all the cables and controlled the back. They had no hope after that point.
You and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about
Shortly after the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Chuck Miller is back in the United States.
Our first witness this morning is Mr. C.O. Miller, Director of the Bureau of Aviation Safety of the NTSB.
This time, he's facing questions from American senators.
A potentially catastrophic design defect.
A special hearing begins to find out how a problem that was identified in 1972 could bring another plane down 2 years later.
Of course, our understanding up to this time, they all had been.
What you've got to now discover is why wasn't that door fixed? Why would a major, venerable, mighty American corporation deliberately do something like this?
Less than a month after the near crash over Windsor, the NTSB had made 2 very specific recommendations. Miller and his investigators recommended that a change be made to the locking mechanism.
Engage the lever.
They wanted to make sure that it was physically impossible for baggage handlers to close the lever without the locking pins being in place. They also suggested that vents be put into the floors of all DC-10s. This would rapidly allow the pressurized cabin air to equalize without collapsing the floor. But in the 2 years since the accident, neither one of these recommendations was implemented.
There is a fundamental problem at the heart of aviation safety, and that has been in the United States for a very long time, and that is that it's the job of the NTSB to discover what's happened and to come up with recommendations as to how to prevent it happening again, but it has absolutely no authority to implement them.
The NTSB does not have regulatory authority. They have to turn to the FAA, as they did, and say, we want these things done. And that's where the system went wrong.
If the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, issues an airworthiness directive, planes are pulled out of service until the proper fix is made. But as serious as the problems on the DC-10 were, no airworthiness directive was ever issued. A so-called gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas stopped it from happening.
The gentleman's agreement is the root cause of Paris. There is no question that if an airworthiness directive had been issued, as it should have been after Windsor, Paris would not have happened. It was an entirely avoidable accident.
McDonnell Douglas assured the FAA that it would fix the problem voluntarily. An airworthiness directive would cast a shadow on the still fledgling DC-10.
The last thing in the world you want is for the public or any of the airlines who are going to be operating these airplanes to think, oh, maybe there's some flaws in this bird. And so an airworthiness directive, especially one that requires you to go back and re-engineer something, is a really horrific thought for a manufacturer.
McDonnell Douglas did make changes to the way the cargo door was built. A peephole was cut in the bottom of the door so baggage handlers could see if the locking pins had engaged. Several warning signs were also attached to the plane's door. The company also made other changes to the DC-10. These included increasing the length of the locking pins and attaching a plate to the inside of the door. This plate would make it physically impossible to push down the lever if the door wasn't properly locked. But each of the proposed fixes had its own problem. Many baggage handlers didn't know what the small window in the door was for. And the baggage handler in Paris read and spoke 3 languages, but not English, the only language in which the warning signs were written. The support plate that was supposed to be installed in the door was never attached to the jet that crashed in Paris. Papers confirming the completion of the work are also uncovered. But no matter what the paper trail says, the fix was never made.
Again, the problem is you don't have an independent FAA inspector coming along to look and see it and then put his stamp on it because it wasn't an airworthiness directive.
In the years following the Turkish Airlines crash, an enormous flurry of lawsuits are filed in California. The tragic story of the DC-10 has one more surprise in store. It's 1974, and an unprecedented series of lawsuits are being filed against McDonnell Douglas. The families of those who died near Paris want someone held responsible.
As time went by, I learned more and more about what actually happened and realized that it was not an accident as we would call an accident. It was totally avoidable. My goal was to expose these people.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, lawyers who are involved in the case have access to the entire history of the DC-10's development. They're not the only ones who pore through the evidence. So does journalist Paul Eddy.
We were determined to get to those documents and that testimony. Somebody gave us a key to the depository where the documents were, and so at night we would go in and then had a huge accumulated pile of documents to go through in order to find out what they've been up to.
Reading through the immense pile of paper, Eddy makes an incredible discovery. A memo written by Don Applegate, the Director of Product Engineering for Convair, the company who'd built the cargo door for McDonnell Douglas.
I think the point when we knew we got them was the Applegate Memorandum that specifically pre-warned this would happen.
The memo is a damning indictment of the cargo doors that were being made for the DC-10 and the lack of venting in the cabin floors. It warns that it's only a matter of time before there's a major disaster involving the doors.
The airplane demonstrated an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure when exposed to explosive decompression of the cargo compartment.
The memo, written just weeks after the near disaster in Windsor, recommends that immediate changes be made to the DC-10 cargo door.
You know you've got them. You know you've got them because you know they knew.
During the court case, another chilling find is made. Not only did McDonnell Douglas know about the problem after Windsor, they knew during the development of the DC-10. 4 years before the Paris crash, 2 years before Windsor, the cargo door failed during a pressure test. The company knew there was a problem, but the fundamental design of the door stayed the same.
I could not believe a large corporation, McDonnell Douglas at the time, could do such a thing, could risk our lives, ordinary people's lives, for the sake of money.
Well, in aviation, it's called tombstone technology. In other words, we always have the balance of money. And unfortunately, over the years, it has been true more times than not that we have had to wait until we had enough people die in an accident to say, you know, we really are going to have to spend the money over here.
The Applegate memo and other information that comes out during the court case leads to one of the biggest settlements in the history of aviation. McDonnell Douglas paid over $80 million in damages. After the Paris crash, foolproof changes were finally made to the DC-10 cargo door. And this time, nothing was left to chance. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive that ensured the doors would never again open in midair. And it worked. After Paris, there wasn't another serious incident involving the cargo doors on a DC-10. But the plane's history and an intensely competitive industry did have an impact. McDonnell Douglas sold far fewer commercial DC-10s than it had once hoped for.
Most of the pilots that I know who have flown the DC-10 over the years really love the old bird. She's probably a little more clunky than the 747 in terms of her heaviness of flight controls, but it's still a lovely bird to fly.
That's fine, but you can't disassociate either the airplane or the company from the awful reputation that the crash left.
Eventually, McDonnell Douglas itself disappears. The company was bought by Boeing in 1996. In the forest outside Paris, a monument now stands honoring those who were killed on Flight 981. A permanent reminder of one of the most disturbing crashes in the history of aviation.
You never forget. And I've gone on to lead my life for 30-odd years, but I've never forgotten. People to this day think it was an accident, and it wasn't.
New Hope, Georgia, April the 4th, 1977.
Hello? My husband called me and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming.
One of the worst storms in years is moving across the South. Sadie Hurst rushes her children to safety.
We heard this tremendous noise. When I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection like fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening.
72 people are killed when a Southern Airways DC-9 falls from the sky.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
May I see your boarding pass, please?
Certainly.
Just down the aisle on the right, sir. Enjoy your flight.
Thank you.
Boarding pass?
81 passengers board Southern Airways Flight 242, a DC-9 bound for Atlanta, Georgia. Many of them are military personnel from nearby bases. Captain Bill McKenzie and First Officer Lyman Keel have been shuttling passengers across the American South all day.
Who's got the lander?
Not me, says the captain.
Ignition, sir.
Pilots regularly exchange tasks on long days like this one. First Officer Lyman Keel will be handling this leg of the flight. He's an experienced Navy pilot who's been with Southern Airways for 4 years. Before their last takeoff, the crew was handed a weather report for the airports along their route.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
The DC-9 was introduced in 1965 to fly frequent short flights. Both of its engines are mounted to the rear fuselage rather than the wings. It was designed for takeoff on shorter runways.
We had a 13 landing day, which was a lot of small stops, about 20 or 30-minute legs in between, and it was sort of the tour of the South.
Skies have been smooth all afternoon, but the weather's worsening. The flight crew is prepared for turbulence.
It was raining in Huntsville, and they said, oh, it's going to be some bad weather, don't serve. So we did not serve from Huntsville to Atlanta, which is a very short route, and we were delighted not to be serving.
I was a little surprised that we took off when we did. I really thought we'd taxi out to the end of the runway and hold for a while because the weather looked so bad. But we taxied out and immediately took off.
At 3:54 p.m., the DC-9 takes off into a hard rain. The short hop to Atlanta should take just 25 minutes. As Southern Airways 242 flies away from Huntsville, the National Weather Service tracks weather that's far worse than the pilots expect. Tornadoes are touching down all across the South.
The weather in the Southeast in the United States can be very treacherous. High humidities, high temperatures are a prescription for thunderstorms. And so with all of that kind of moisture in the air and the high convective heating, you're going to have very large thunderstorms that are associated with heavy rains, hail, icing conditions, and extreme winds. And of course, tornadoes that will be spawned from that kind of action.
Huntsville Air Traffic Control has some concerns about the gathering storm.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation, starting about 5 miles ahead.
Okay, we're in the rain right now. It doesn't look much heavier than what we're in right now, does it?
It's not a solid mass, but it appears to be a little bit heavier than what you're in right now.
In 1977, most airliners are equipped with the Bendix weather radar. Pilots are trained to avoid regions that appear bright. Where there's light, there's bad weather.
I can't read that. This looks like rain, Bill. What do you think? There's a hole.
There's a hole right there. That's all I see.
The pilots spot a dark area on their radar, a passageway through the storm. They plan to navigate between towering thunderheads over 14,000 meters.
Coming over, we had pretty good radar. I believe right straight ahead. There. The next few miles is probably the best way we can go.
But as they head towards the storm system, they get an ominous report from Memphis Air Traffic Control.
Attention, all aircraft. SIGMET. Tennessee, Southern Louisiana, Mississippi.
SIGMET is short for Significant Meteorological Information, a warning to pilots that dangerous weather is in the region.
Here we go. Hold them, cowboy.
Pilots don't want to be within 50 miles of a lot of those types of thunderstorms for the very reason that the airplane may not be able to handle it, and or the pilots may not be able to control the airplane flying into that kind of activity.
Mackenzie and Keel take a harder look at their weather radar.
It looks heavy. Nothing's going through that.
Mysteriously, the gap the pilots thought they'd spotted no longer seems to exist.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
The storm suddenly gets much worse.
Never heard such loud hail in my life, and in beating on the, sides of the airplane was extremely deafening.
The hail was probably the loudest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like I was in a metal barrel with someone throwing rocks at me.
Please keep your seatbelts fastened. We should be out of this shortly.
Hail the size of baseballs hammers the DC-9, breaking the plane's windshield.
The pilots of Southern 242 had to raise their voices audibly to be heard above the unholy tattoo of this hail, which was buckshotting the airplane. These pilots had never been through anything like this before in their lives.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
I know. You're just gonna have to go out.
Yeah, right across that bay.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
Mackenzie and Keel desperately seek an escape route from the storm. But as they do, the emergency escalates. The plane loses all electrical power. Without power, Keel must keep the aircraft level without an artificial horizon.
Now the pilots are left to look back out the window and try and orient the airplane with the horizon.
But surrounded by thick cloud, a horizon is difficult to find. It's almost impossible for Lyman Keel to get his bearings.
Southern 242, what's your speed?
Atlanta Air Traffic Control tries to make contact with Southern Airways. They receive no response.
Southern 242, Atlanta, what's your speed?
After I realized that we had a disaster in progress, or something was wrong, I got up and started briefing my passengers.
The flight attendants were very quick in giving us emergency landing instructions. There was not very much time for anyone to start panicking.
Got it back. Got it back, Bill. Got it back. Got it back.
After 36 seconds in the dark, power returns. The instruments come alive and the radio begins working again. Air traffic control finally gets through to Mackenzie and Keel.
Maintain 15,000 if you understand me.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has been instructed to fly at 4,600 meters. But the plane has fallen to almost 4,200 meters.
We're trying to get it up there.
While I was looking out at the front of the left engine, I could see the hail continuing to put more and more dents into the cowling around the engine and into the cone in the center of the engine.
and the engine was starting to make sounds like it was quitting.
Okay, 242, we just got our windshield busted. We'll try to get it back up to 15. We're at 14.
Southern 242, you say you're at 14 now?
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
You say you lost an engine and busted a windshield?
Yes, sir.
My God. The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Both engines are now out. This DC-9 is a glider, and it's falling at 56 feet per second. They're at 14,000 feet. They don't have a lot of time.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
Lyman Keel adjusts his course to navigate his plane out of the storm. Captain Mackenzie must restart the engines, or they'll be forced to make an emergency landing. Without engines, Southern Airways Flight 242 is plummeting from the sky. There's also another dire consequence of the engine failure. Normally, the engines generate electricity for the instruments, radios, and hydraulics. When the engines quit, all of these systems fail.
APU deployed.
The APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, is a backup power generator. It will provide electricity to the plane, but it will take more than 2 minutes for it to power up.
Once they had finished their instructions and there was simply a waiting period before we landed, we turned to each other and said that we would all get through this together, and we held hands for a moment.
When the second engine quit, I wasn't aware of what was going on around me. I was so focused on trying to figure out a way to save myself. I knew that sometimes the tail breaks off in an accident, and I felt the further back I could get, the better.
There we go.
After 2 minutes without systems, the Auxiliary Power Unit finally kicks in. The pilots may not have engines, but at least they now have power.
We lost both engines. How about getting us a vector to the nearest place?
Captain Mackenzie needs directions to an airport. The flight can only stay airborne for another 6 minutes. Dorbin's Air Force Base is 32 kilometers away. It has a runway that's long enough for a DC-9. It also has full emergency services.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
It's Dobbins weather, Bill. How far is it? How far is it?
Lyman Keel knows Dobbins Air Force Base intimately. He trained there, and it's now his home base as a Navy Reserve pilot. He's landed there frequently.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
Right now, Keel's familiarity with Dobbins is the only advantage this crew has. Less than 16 kilometers away lies the town of New Hope, Georgia. Sadie Hurst sees no signs of an advancing storm.
It was an absolutely beautiful day. The children were playing outside. They were riding their bicycles up and down the driveway.
Hello? Hey, you.
My husband worked in Atlanta, and he kept his radio on the Huntsville radio station. And he called me, and he said, honey, we've got some bad weather coming in. He said, you need to get the kids in.
Boys, come on in now. Nasty weather's coming. Come in now. All right, flashlights and batteries, Stephen.
Ordinarily, tornadoes come with bad weather, you know, dark clouds and rain and hail. But we didn't see any of that.
Southern Airways 242 finally breaks through the storm clouds into clear skies. The plane descends steadily through 2,100 meters.
Get those engines started.
Once the engines failed, the workload in the cockpit increased substantially. In this particular instance, the first officer was the, quote, pilot flying. He was the one that was actually manipulating the flight controls and maneuvering the airplane. The captain, on the other hand, was now running checklist and trying to troubleshoot.
Listen, we lost both engines, and I can't tell you the implications of this. We only got 2 engines. And how far is Dobbins now?
Southern 242.
19 miles. Do you have 1 engine running now?
Negative. No engines.
I didn't know what was wrong, but I could tell something was wrong. I went and opened the cockpit door simply to tell them we're ready for whatever.
Just don't stall this thing out.
No, I won't.
Bill, what's going on?
Not now, Kathy. Sit down.
You could tell they were afraid. I understood that they were afraid just for the sound of their voice. So I understood that there was something very dangerous going on, but I had no idea what.
Down to only 1,400 meters, the plane is still 27 kilometers from Dobbins Air Force Base.
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
What?
Ask him if there's anything between here and Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
First Officer Lyman Keel doesn't think he can get the DC-9 as far as Dobbins Air Force Base. He's lost too much altitude.
I doubt we're gonna make it, but we're trying everything to get something started.
Roger. Well, there is Cartersville. You're about 10 miles south of Cartersville.
15 miles west of Dobbins.
Keel needs a closer airport. Cartersville seems like a good choice.
We'll take a vector to that, yes. We'll have to go there.
Can you give us a vector to Cartersville?
All right, turn left, heading 360. Will be direct vector to Cartersville.
Air traffic controllers in Atlanta see no other options. They direct Flight 242 to Cartersville Airport. As the pilots seek out an airport, the flight attendants still don't know what type of landing to prepare for.
They wouldn't talk to me. When I looked in the door, the whole windshield was cracked. So what do we do? I think we've lost both the engines. I thought so. Okay. Kathy, have you briefed all your passengers? Mm-hmm.
I realized I was in an emergency situation and I felt like I was going to die, but I decided I would do everything I could to try to help my chances. I had previously collected some blankets and pillows and had gotten my leather jacket off the overhead rack. And I arranged those to make a nest as much as I could for myself.
With tornadoes in the forecast, the community of New Hope is braced for a different type of danger.
After a couple hours of playing outside, my mother called us in to come in because there was bad weather coming our way. We came into the house, and Mother had told us about what was going on, and she said that we need to get downstairs to prepare for the bad weather that was coming.
Southern Airways Flight 242 has lost too much altitude. The pilots come to the frightening conclusion that at the rate they're falling, they can't make it to Cartersville. They must prepare to land now.
I'm picking out a clear field.
Bill, you have to find me a highway.
Let's get the next clear open field.
No, Bill.
See a highway over there. No cars.
Right there. Is that straight?
No.
We'll have to take it.
Lyman Keel decides to bring the plane down onto a rural highway, Georgia State Highway 92. Captain Bill McKenzie radios Atlanta Air Traffic Control with the bad news.
We're putting it on the highway. We're down to nothing.
The clock runs out on Southern Airways 242.
Sweet Jesus.
With no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel lines up the aircraft for an emergency landing on the highway that runs through New Hope, Georgia.
In the last minute, we did a steep left bank in which we were able to see the pine trees that were very close to the aircraft.
Flaps.
They're down to 50.
Oh, God, Bill. I hope we can do it.
Without training on how to land a DC-9 with no engines, First Officer Lyman Keel's attempt is entirely improvised.
Lyman Keel is a young man who has just come back from the proving ground of Southeast Asia, where he was a naval aviator. He learned the niceties of landing on a rolling, pitching aircraft carrier in the South China Sea in the middle of the night. What he was confronted with right now was even a greater test, the greatest test he had ever confronted in his life as an airman.
I'm gonna land right over that guy.
There's a car ahead.
I got it. I got it now. I got it.
Brace for impact!
The Southern Airways flight touches down on State Highway 92.
When the aircraft touched down, the first touchdown was very, very nice. It was smooth. It seemed like it was going to work and everything was going to turn out okay. And then it immediately bounced back up in the air and slammed down.
Each bump that we made seemed to be harder and louder than the previous one.
The plane smashes into New Hope.
Before the plane completely stopped moving, there was fire blowing through the cabin. I felt my face burning, even though I tried to cover it with my leather jacket.
We heard this tremendous noise.
Large sections of Southern Airways 242 litter the entire length of New Hope.
Come on, damn it.
I got my seatbelt loose after a few tries and turned toward the rear of the airplane, and I saw a spot of light. I got up and ran for that light. I could not believe I was alive. I just could not believe it.
Where I found myself after we woke up, sort of indescribable. I was sitting by the front entry door. We have a coat closet that was adjacent to it and the back wall that the jump seat's strapped to. All three of those walls had collapsed and rolled into like a little triangle ball area. And there was just enough room for me inside. And I could see a crack of light, and I thought, I'm going through that crack of light, come hell or high water.
In the very next instant, as if I had just blinked my eyes, instead of seeing the carpet between my feet, I suddenly was looking at blue sky above me. I realized I was lying flat on my back in the dirt. Everything to the left of me was flaming wreckage. I didn't even recognize it as being the plane that I had just been thrown out of. I thought it was maybe a house that we had hit.
Stewardess Sandy Pearl also escapes safely. She's able to help others. Survivors flee the flaming wreckage.
When when I got to the top of the basement steps to close the door, I saw a red reflection like fire in the door. That's when I saw what was happening. I saw smoke and fire. And the people that were coming toward me, they weren't screaming, they weren't yelling, they were quiet.
Everything was on fire, and I could see people running toward a house.
I need to use your phone.
I wanted to call the local people or Southern or somebody and say, we've just landed somewhere and we need help.
It just became a blur. They just kept coming.
You help her.
I got back to the kitchen and I was just circled by people. They knew they were in a house, and I guess they felt safe, and they needed somebody to help them. I was still frantic. I was still trying to move as quickly as possible and do as much as I could at the time.
And I'll remember to the day I died just staring there at the trees burning and pine trees burning and pieces of aircraft. It was so unreal. I've never seen anything like it and never want to see anything like that again.
"72 people, including pilots Lyman Keel and Bill McKenzie, die in the crash of Southern Airways Flight 242. Investigators would soon uncover a tragic series of miscues and coincidences that caused the plane to crash.
Southern Flight 242 crashed after the DC-9 jet lost power in both engines. The plane had just flown through a violent hailstorm on a flight from Huntsville, Alabama to Atlanta.
I saw the plane as it came veering down, hit the treetops. We thought it was a tornado at first. Vehicles, people that was in this grocery store yard and vehicles, it actually hit them.
A family of 7 is killed instantly when the plane hit their car.
They were just leaving the store about the time that the flight tried to land on the highway. And then, of course, I think they hit the gas pumps and they exploded and everything around was on fire. And like I said, they were in the car and perished during the explosion and fire.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive within hours of the accident. This is the second major blow to Southern Airways' safety record. In 1970, Flight 932, carrying the Marshall University football team, crashed in West Virginia. Everyone on board was killed.
There are always many questions that investigators have to find answers to. The 2 primary questions that needed to be answered by the board were what were the weather conditions and what caused both engines on a 2-engine airplane to flame out that resulted in the pilots having to make an emergency landing on a highway in a small town.
The storm that Flight 242 flew into was a monster. Why had a crew so familiar with weather in the South flown headfirst into it?
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Investigators listened to the cockpit voice recorder for any clues about the decisions made by the crew as they were entering the thunderstorm.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
They learned that the pilots relied heavily on their weather radar as they approached the storm. But it appears to have deceived them.
All clear left, approximately right now. I think we can cut across there.
One of the limitations of the radar that the crew of Flight 242 was using is signal attenuation. That is that the beam that is projected from the radar unit out to look at the weather and return is diffused, so that the picture that is depicted in the cockpit that the crew is looking at may not be accurate.
Weather radar sends out radio waves. Those waves bounce off storm clouds ahead and return to the aircraft. But if precipitation is extremely intense, the radio waves can be deflected away. The radar unit might then interpret the lack of returning waves as a clear path ahead.
Those inaccuracies are hard to decipher, and if the crew is depending solely or very intently on the radar to guide them through the precipitation, they may be making decisions that aren't based on accurate information.
The storm that entangled Southern Airways 242 is one of the worst to hit the United States in 3 years. The crew didn't encounter a tornado, but it was battered by torrential rain and heavy hail.
Which way do we cross here or go out? I don't know how we get through here, Bill.
What Keel and Mackenzie read as a clear area ahead was in fact the heaviest part of the storm. They flew straight for it.
The other engine's going too.
Got the other engine going too.
Southern 242, say again.
Stand by. We lost both engines.
Once inside the storm, the DC-9's engines failed. But a turbofan engine is designed to ingest huge amounts of rain and even hail. Precipitation alone should not have shut them down. Investigators study what's left of the DC-9's engines for clues. They need to know if some mechanical failure caused both engines to fail inside the storm.
Well, initially I was puzzled as to how the engines could be involved in the cause of this accident, but I was very anxious to get there to see the engines myself to find out if there was any sort of visible failure in the engines.
Pratt & Whitney, the manufacturer of the engines, assigns Al Weaver to advise the NTSB investigation. The engines are moved to Atlanta Airport for a closer inspection.
And when they lifted the engines up in the vertical direction in the hangar, I could hear the tinkling and pieces fell out through the front of the engine onto the floor. I reached over and picked up those pieces, and I recognized them immediately as part of the high compressor blading deep within inside the engine.
Al Weaver discovers that the pieces that fell from the engine were broken blades from the compressor. Jet engines need pressurized air for combustion. 2 separate compressors inside the engine are made up of dozens of steel blades. The rapidly spinning blades force air to the back of the engine. The pressurized air is ignited in the combustion chamber, creating thrust. Weaver notices that the compressor blades from Flight 242 are badly bent or fatigued. The way they're bent tells him they were damaged in the air, not when the plane hit the ground.
And we know that that fatiguing and the type of fatigue that we could observe with our eye is caused by the repetitive surging of the engine over and over.
A surge occurs when the airflow through an engine gets interrupted. Pressure builds up between the compressors instead of behind them. Without the back pressure, air from the combustion chamber moves to the front of the engine. The engine briefly loses power. Next, investigators need to find out if the repetitive surging was caused by the engines inhaling massive amounts of rain. When an engine ingests rain, it has to convert it into a gas before it can pump it out as exhaust. That process uses energy and slows down the engines. Investigators conclude that with so much rain to convert, the engines couldn't maintain enough power to run the generators. That's what caused the first power outage. But it doesn't explain why the engines failed completely. Al Weaver wants to know if the sheer volume of rain the engines were forced to ingest could have caused their failure. The same engine model that powered Southern Airways 242 is run with up to 14% water to air.
Okay, engines at 3/4 throttle. Let's begin.
Investigators ultimately throw monsoon-level rains against the engine. They run it from idle up to full throttle.
Okay, that's it. Shut it down.
The rain was not enough to cause the kind of surge that tore the engines on Flight 242 to pieces.
Thanks very much, gentlemen.
And the engine operated normally, no abnormalities. So our judgment was we could not conceive of a rainstorm that would put more water in. So we knew we were going in the wrong direction with more water.
The water ingestion test points investigators to another suspect.
That's a hole, isn't it?
It's not showing a hole, is it?
Hail. People who survived the crash describe seeing hail the size of baseballs. It was powerful enough to break the plane's 3.5 centimeter thick windshield. Al Weaver discovers significant hail damage on both of the plane's engine cowlings.
Starting at the front of the engine, we noted that the inlet cowl and the center body that streamlines the airflow going into the engine, which are parts of the aircraft structure and made out of aluminum, were all dented from both engines. And that led us to suspect that the existence of the hail might have been a significant contributor.
Weaver knows that it would take a powerful force to damage the hard metal compressor blades.
We knew from the examination mechanically of the engines that the hail itself did not cause any damage to the engine. It only dented the outside of the covering over the engine.
Heavy precipitation and a damaged cowling could have interrupted the engine's airflow and caused a surge. But one surge shouldn't tear an engine apart. Weaver suspects that massive pieces of hail may have clogged a vital outlet in the plane's engines: the bleed valves. When pressure builds between the two compressors, bleed valves should open automatically to release that pressure and clear the surge. If the bleed valves were blocked, the engines would have continued to surge over and over again.
Once the engine began to surge, the action that the pilot should have taken was to pull the throttles back to clear the surge.
Al Weaver turns to the cockpit voice recorder and discovers that the circumstances may have caused the crew to do the exact opposite.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
We're trying to get it up there.
Weaver learns that the crew was asked to climb while in the heart of the storm.
Maintain 15,000, if you understand me.
Maintain 15,000, Southern 242.
In order to climb, the captain had to increase thrust to his engines, which would have made matters worse.
But if the surge was not cleared and allowed to continue, then the engine would simply break itself internally.
We're trying to get it up there.
Advancing the throttles would only worsen the situation.
With its bleed cavities blocked by hail, pressure built up inside the engines, bending the compressor blades until they shattered.
Left engine won't spool.
Our left engine just cut out.
And once the blades broke in the compressor, then the engine has no hope of ever working again.
Investigators now understand how the pilots misread the storm and how their engines failed as a result of it. But they don't know why the pilots weren't warned that there was such a severe storm in their path.
Who's got the landing?
Not me. Just the captain.
Ignition, sir.
As the pilots prepared to depart Huntsville, they did have a weather report from Southern Airways. But the information was already hours old.
Looks like you guys got a good one coming.
Southern Airways dispatch did not have updated information. They didn't subscribe to the National Weather Service's update system. They did have a subscription to a service that required them to dial up and receive the information. When the dispatcher called the phone number to get the updated information, it was busy and never pursued it, and was not able to provide any kind of update information to the crew of 242.
Southern Airways 242, I'm painting a line of weather which appears to be moderate to possibly heavy precipitation, starting about 5 miles ahead.
Could Huntsville have provided better weather information? Absolutely. But in the course of doing their job, they provided localized weather information about an intense thunderstorm or rain shower that was moving over the airport. They were only responsible really for about 40 nautical miles. What the crew of Flight 242 was looking at was well beyond 40 miles.
With little information on the storm and having misread their weather radar, Bill McKenzie and Lyman Keel flew blindly into massive thunderheads. The heavy rain and hail crippled their engines. The crew decided that their only option was an emergency landing.
We lost both engines. How about getting to Becker to the nearest place?
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
When investigators analyze the flight path of Southern Airways 242, they discover one more deadly oversight.
From the time the crew realized that they had no engine power till the time of touchdown was about 9 minutes. So in looking at the critical decision making, they had about 7 minutes of solid critical decision making before they were committed to that emergency landing on the highway.
Get us a vector to a clear area, Atlanta.
After the engines failed, the pilots made a 180-degree turn towards the west, looking for an escape from the storm. That takes them directly away from Dobbins Air Force Base. The turn takes the pilots out of the hailstorm, but leaves them further away from a runway. They also lose minutes of valuable flying time. Only once the pilots escape the hailstorm do they turn again towards Dobbins.
Is there an airport between our position and Dobbins?
Southern 242, no, sir. Closest airport is Dobbins.
Had they maintained that course to Dobbins, rather than make the turns or try to find another airport, they probably would have had a better success rate and definitely a better survival rate.
Southern 242, roger. Turn right heading 100.
Will be vectors for a straight-in approach to Dobbins. Runway 11.
By the time McKenzie received the instructions, Southern Airways 242 had been flying away from Dobbins for too long. The plane was simply too far and flying too low to make it there.
Declare an emergency, Bill.
But there was one last missed opportunity to save Flight 242. Investigators learned that just as McKenzie and Keel were directed towards Dobbins Air Force Base, they were right above another runway. Cornelius Moore Airport.
I thought we would land at Cornelius Moore Airport because I was familiar with that airport. I had flown many times in our airplane back and forth between Decatur and Atlanta.
Investigators learned that Cornelius Moore was just out of range of radar at Atlanta Approach Control. They didn't know it existed. They could not direct Southern Airways 242 there because they couldn't see it on their screens.
When I learned that the controllers in Atlanta didn't know about the Cornelius Moore Airport in Cartersville, I was upset because we went within, I think, 3 or 4 miles of that airport, had a 4,000-foot runway, and even though some of the controllers thought it was too short, it sure would have been better than that highway we landed on.
I was very, very angry. That's such a futile reaction. You know, there was such a waste of life that I was sad.
The NTSB investigation concludes that the catastrophic failure of the turbofan engines and the failure to convey sufficient information on the storm to the pilots are the causes of the crash of Southern Airways 242. The NTSB acts immediately. It issues a recommendation that weather radar systems aboard planes and in air traffic control centers be upgraded to better portray weather systems.
In today's commercial aircraft, pilots have available to them color weather radar. It's radar that will depict in various color bands the intensity of the precipitation.
The crash of Southern Airways 242 also leads to a better understanding of how engines should be managed in heavy precipitation.
We once again reaffirmed to the pilots the importance not to allow the engine to continue operation in continual surging. If there is a surge condition for any reason, you should clear the surge, because if you didn't clear the surge and allowed it to operate, it would break eventually.
In every air crash, investigators try to determine whether or not the accident was survivable.
When you look at the survivability in an aircraft accident, you can definitively say that the design of the seat contributed to the survival factors aspects. But the statistics that bear out whether sitting in the front of the airplane is safer, the middle of the airplane is safer, or the back of the airplane is safer don't exist. In this particular instance, a surviving passenger, Don Foster, was quick thinking. He put a leather jacket over his head and used a pillow as a buffer between the seat in front of him and his face. That probably saved his life from the standpoint that it minimized any injuries he would have suffered.
In fact, the NTSB believes that if flight attendants had distributed blankets and pillows to the passengers, there would have been fewer injuries as a result of the crash.
We learned from every airplane crash. We learned from this one. We learned that the communication broke down within the FAA, within Southern Airways, even within the cockpit of that DC-9. What we didn't ultimately learn, though, is the most important lesson, and that is awesome respect for Mother Nature and what Mother Nature can do.
30 years have passed since Southern Airways 242 crashed through the small community of New Hope, Georgia. Every 10 years since the crash, survivors of the tragedy gather at a church in New Hope. They remember those that were lost and help one another cope with the tragedy. It's one of the longest-running survivors group of its kind.
I want to welcome you to this service today in remembering April the 4th, 1977, when the Southern Airways Flight 242 crashed here in the New Hope community.
Earl D. Johnson. Lyman Keel, Jr. William Wade McKenzie.
Earl C. Griffin, Jr.
After the crash, I had a hard time understanding how I managed to survive. And after a couple of months, I quit worrying about it. I felt like I had a second shot at it. I felt like that family was more important, having fun was more important.
It took a pretty deep toll on our family, my mother and my father especially. They lost 2 of their children and all their grandchildren all at one time.
And I can still, to this day, I can smell the odors, and I can hear the sounds, and I can see those people. So many things will bring back those smallest memories. And every time it's triggered, the emotions come back. You don't want them to, you don't ask for them, but you can't stop them.
I believe it's important for the survivors to get together so that they can share their experiences, know that there are other people that went through the same feelings that they did.
I mean, I've had a great life because of this, in a way. That makes no sense, but it's changed me for the better. I think I've done better, had a better life because of how I grew from that.
May this service do honor to these dear loved ones, and may it bring comfort and peace to we who remain.
down and turn to your right.
If you force it, you'll break it.
This won't come out, Bob.
Push the switch forward.
A single light bulb is preventing a modern jetliner from landing.
Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
Struggling to fix a minor problem, a much more serious one develops.
We're still at 2,000, man. Hey, what's happening here?
The plane crashes in a remote swamp. Those who survived the crash face a new danger. The swamp has filled with jet fuel.
No one light a match!
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation history.
The crash would point investigators to an astonishing danger lurking in all commercial cockpits.
Mayday.
December 29th, 1972, the dawn of the jumbo jet era. On its way to Florida, this L-1011 TriStar is the most advanced passenger jet in the world.
The Lucky TriStar was a fascinating bird. It was a beautifully flying airplane. It had a tremendous amount of power and a lot of innovation to it.
The cabin of this Eastern Airlines jet is large and quiet. The service is first-rate. Bob Loft is the captain for Eastern Airlines Flight 401. He's been with the airline for more than 30 years. His first officer is Albert Stockstill. His second officer is Donald Repo. The jet has left the bitter cold of New York behind and is now descending towards Miami.
Welcome to Miami. The temperature's in the low 70s, and it's a beautiful night out there tonight. Go ahead and throw them out.
Angelo Donadeo is an off-duty Eastern Airlines maintenance expert. He's catching a ride back to Miami. There are 176 people on board tonight's flight. Most are heading south for New Year's. Ron and Lily Infantino have been married for only 20 days. They've just spent Christmas with his family.
The seatbelt sign came on as normal. We're in a final approach. I look out the window there and I could see lights at the airport.
Close to midnight, the plane begins its approach to Miami International Airport. Stockstill flies the plane, while Repo performs a landing checklist.
Radar. Up. Off. Hydraulic panels checked. 35, 33. Gear down.
The captain notices a problem.
Bird, is that handling? No nose gear.
The light showing that the nose gear is locked hasn't lit up.
I'm gonna raise it back up.
The gear might not be all the way down. Loft tries again. The sound of the landing gear echoes through the plane.
It makes a pretty loud grinding noise. If you've flown very much, you're familiar with that sound. So they did that several times. The pilots did that several times, and we weren't alarmed. It's just one of those things that happens sometimes, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, great, we're gonna be late getting home.
Still no light. Loft isn't sure if his front landing gear is locked. If it isn't, landing could be disastrous.
Tower, this is Eastern 401. Looks like we're gonna have to circle. We don't have a light on our nose gear yet.
Eastern 401 Heavy, roger. Pull up, climb straight ahead to 2000. Go back to approach control, 128.6.
You want me to test the lights or not? Yeah, check it.
Flight engineer Repo performs a test nicknamed the Christmas tree. It lights up every warning light in the cockpit to see if the bulbs are working. The nose gear indicator light fails the test. The bulb is probably burnt out. But there's a slim chance of a double failure. Both the light bulb and the landing gear could be broken.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
But the troublesome bulb is out of the captain's reach. On the ground, air traffic control directs Flight 401 to climb to 2,000 feet and circle away from the airport until the problem is solved.
You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
It's right above that red one, isn't
Yeah,
it?
I can't get at it from here.
Wow. Yeah, I can't make a call out either.
It's a moonless night. As the plane veers away from Miami, there's total darkness outside.
All of a sudden, it turned pitch dark again. And that means we were going back out west, towards the Everglades.
Co-pilot Stockstill is flying the plane, but Captain Loft needs his help to solve the problem.
Put the autopilot on here.
The TriStar is equipped with the most sophisticated autopilot in history. It actually has the ability to land the plane on its own. Stockstill programs it to fly at 2,000 feet.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
The light is finally removed. Richard Pragluski is an aviation engineer. He takes this flight regularly and can tell that the plane is experiencing technical problems.
He was heading out towards the Everglades. I knew there was something wrong with the plane because if you have a delay, they'll circle the plane.
The irritating problem isn't getting better. Now Stockstill can't get the light back in.
Now, push the switch just forward. Okay. You got it sideways then.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 300.
Okay, 300, Eastern 401. Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
The electronics bay on the plane is underneath the cockpit. The room, nicknamed the Hellhole, is a unique feature on wide-bodied jets. The front landing gear mechanism can be seen from there.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this?
Hold down and turn to your right.
Anything I can do it with?
Turn to your left one time.
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob. If I had a pair of pliers, I could cushion it with that
I
Kleenex.
can give you a pair of pliers, but if you force it, you'll break it. Just believe
To hell with it, to hell with this! Get down and see if we're lined up with that red line, that's all we care. Screwing around with a 20-cent piece of light equipment on this plane.
As the crew struggles to fix the problem. In the cabin, Richard Pragluski sees something peculiar out of his window.
I could see a tower to my right in the distance, and it looked like we were going into a glide path, which I found very strange.
Pragluski has noticed something the pilots haven't. The plane is getting closer and closer to the swamp below. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is flying over the Florida Everglades. Below it, nothing but a dark, deserted swamp. To passenger Richard Pragluski, something doesn't seem right.
I felt it kind of strange that they hadn't made any announcements. But again, he was still fairly high off the ground. And I figured they would come out and tell us that when they were going to make the landing. So I wasn't overly concerned.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Looks square to me.
Can't you get the hole lined up?
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there. It's always something. We could have made schedule.
Without a green light, they still don't know if their landing gear is locked. Flight engineer Don Repo is now in the belly of the plane. There's a viewing window in the hellhole which should let him see if the front wheels are locked in place.
Damn.
I don't see it down there.
Huh?
I don't see it.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it. It's pitch dark, and I throw the little light and get nothing.
Wheel well lights on?
Pardon?
Wheel well lights on?
Captain Loft has forgotten to turn on lights outside the plane that illuminate the landing gear.
Now try it.
United 737, turn right in, 010.
At Miami International, controller Charlie Johnson has just finished dealing with another troubled jet.
National 607 has landed without incident.
Fire trucks were deployed, but they weren't used.
He notices that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 seems to have dropped from 2,000 feet to 900. But he's not overly concerned. It's not unusual to get false readings for several radar sweeps in a row.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Captain Loft believes that he'll soon get confirmation that his gear is locked. He wants to return to the airport.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
The plane is heading west, away from the airport. It will take several minutes to get lined up for the landing. Deep in the Everglades, Bob Marcus is hunting frogs with a friend. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 roars past.
I just saw the lights blinking across the sky, and it was so black. There's no horizon in the west, and you could tell how high the plane was.
Suddenly, the pilots make an alarming observation.
We did something to the altitude?
What?
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
I see the lights in the cabin just flickering on and off, and I heard a noise. It was a violent whipping sensation. Then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose.
Charlie Johnson notices that Flight 401's altitude now reads as coastal, or sea level.
Eastern 401, I've lost you on the radar there, your transponder. What's your altitude now?
There's no response from Eastern 401. Another plane makes a disturbing report.
Miami approaches this National 611. We just saw a big flash. Looked like it came out west. Don't know what it means, but wanted to let you know.
In a dark, remote swamp, those who survived the crash find themselves in a nightmare. Bob Marcus races towards the site of the crash.
Oh, I was going as fast as I could. It took me about 15 minutes, I think, to get to the crash site.
Remarkably, Richard Pregluski is alive.
I knew I was badly injured because I could see my clothes hanging from my body. I had almost no clothes on the upper half of the body, and I could see skin coming down my arms. And I also knew that when you're in shock, you feel no pain. So I knew I really was seriously injured. And I started thinking, I said, well, you know, the pain will come later, but how do I keep calm and get out of there? Because the longer I'm in that swamp, the condition I'm in, the more danger I'm in.
When the plane crashed, a huge fireball tore through the cabin.
I remember that fire coming to my face. I remember the flash. I remember that I tried breathing and I could not get my breath. Of course, the fire took all the oxygen out of the air. And that's the last thing I remember until I got up in the swamp itself.
Ron Infantino was knocked out by the crash. He wakes up in the swamp.
So I was thrown quite a bit. And I was away from Verizon or everybody else. Nobody was even near me. Lily. Lily.
He's badly wounded. His new wife, Lily, was sitting next to him, but now she's nowhere to be seen. Swamp water doused the initial flames. But 20,000 kilograms of jet fuel has now leaked into the swamp. A single spark could start a deadly blaze.
No one light a match! We're covered in jet fuel!
What a sad thing to come through that crash and then have somebody do something stupid like strike a match and have us all just blow up. That was the real fear.
Hoping to help the survivors, Bob Marcus jumps into the swamp. He immediately feels the sting of the jet fuel on his skin.
It burnt my legs. I had to treat my legs for burns for about a week.
Marcus quickly spots a survivor who's in grave danger. The badly wounded man is still strapped to his seat. He's on the verge of drowning.
And his head kept dropping down in the water. He came up, he said, "Help me. I can't hold my head up much longer," and then dropped back down in the water. So I helped him, I pulled him up.
Don't worry, I got you. I got you.
Bob Marcus saves dozens of lives, preventing many people from drowning. Isolated from the other survivors and unable to move, Ron Infantino now has a new reason to fear for his life.
After a while, the alligators and the snakes, you could hear them in the weeds coming by, and you could hear the croaking of the alligators because they started to come back to their natural habitat. And as far as I'm concerned, if a gator came up to me or a snake, I was dead meat because I couldn't defend myself at all. And then I heard Christmas caroling.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
To rally the survivors' spirits, Trudy Smith and others sing Christmas carols.
We knew instinctively that we weren't going to get out of there in a hurry because nobody knew where we were. In the middle of the swamp, midnight. So what else are you going to do?
And you got to picture us this, I mean, in the dark at night, or you hear us singing in the wilderness. It was like being on the Titanic going down type of thing, you know? It was unbelievable.
Within minutes, Coast Guard helicopters are sent out in search of the crash site. But in the pitch black night, they can't find the wreckage. Bob Marcus tries to signal the distant helicopters.
But I could see where they were, and they were going the wrong direction. And I just waved the light at them until I saw them turn and head back towards us.
It seemed like we'd been in the swamps for a really long time when we heard a helicopter, and it was such a welcoming sound because that means somebody knows that you're there.
Less than half an hour after the crash, the Coast Guard arrives. The nearest landing site is 100 meters away. Marcus rushes to meet the helicopter and ferry the rescuers back to the crash site. His first passenger is rescue worker Don Schneck.
I made it to the airboat. He asked me, where are all the rescuers? And I said, this is it, let's go. He took us out into the glades to a point where he said, this is as far as I want to go because I don't want to run anybody over. And he said, there are bodies out here all over the place.
Don Schneck starts searching for survivors.
I approached the large object that I had seen at a small distance and realized it was the nose section of the aircraft.
He's amazed to discover that Captain Bob Loft has survived the crash.
He was in bad shape. He had lacerations, so I knew he had broken ribs. I could tell he was in shock, so I calmed him down, told him, I'm the only one here right now, but they're coming. Just hang in there. I'm going to die. He told me that, and I argued with him. Anything to keep anything going. It just made me feel so inadequate because it was just me. I turned around and I looked back towards Miami and thinking, where in the heck is everybody? And at that time when I looked, I must have seen 50 lights coming. And I went, thank God.
First Officer Bert Stockstill was killed during the crash. Captain Bob Loft soon dies at the scene. Angelo Donadeo and Don Repo have survived and are taken to hospital. In all, 77 people survived the crash. 99 people are killed. By dawn, all the wounded have been transported to Miami hospitals. Ron Infantino is one of the many who are struggling to survive.
Priest comes over and does the last rites. So right then I knew I was in bad shape. And it's a scary thought. And of course at that time I'm still asking for Lily, you know, had they seen her? It was such a madhouse there that night, you could imagine.
Lily. Where's Lily?
The crash is headline news around the world. It's the first ever jumbo jet to crash, and it produces the largest number of deaths in US civil aviation history. There's tremendous pressure on investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board to find out what happened.
It was an enormous puzzle because this was the newest, the most sophisticated, the best of the airliners. It apparently was in perfect working condition. So the NTSB perceived that this was going to be a very long investigation that involved multi-level potential problems.
The crash site itself is an important clue for investigators arriving at the scene. The trail of debris is enormously long. That suggests that the plane hit the swamp almost in the same nose-up position as it would while landing at an airport. Its descent was clearly slow and gradual. NTSB investigators have documented the final settings for many of the instruments in the cockpit. They discover that the autopilot was set to maintain an altitude of 2,000 feet. So why didn't it? Maintenance expert Angelo Donadeo is interviewed. All he can tell investigators is the crew was trying to fix a light bulb before the crash. Within days, the plane's 2 black boxes are recovered. Investigators hope they will provide some answers. Before they can extract the data, flight engineer Don Repo dies in hospital. Ron Infantino is given some devastating news of his own. The body of his wife Lily has been found under the plane's wing.
She was just a wonderful person. I was 27 years old, and she was the same age, and it was actually my first love.
Infantino is haunted by the memory of switching seats with Lily just before the crash.
They had swapped seats quite casually earlier during the flight when she had gotten up to go to the restroom. She was thrown into the swamp and drowned, and he lived.
The swamp proves both a blessing and a curse for survivors.
That's what saved most of the lives, actually. Because the plane broke up, it absorbed all the energy. And the mud absorbed it, and the plane just dispersed.
The swamp water is so thick with mud, it also clogs survivors' wounds, preventing many from bleeding to death. But there's a deadly new threat facing some survivors. Their wounds have become infected, contaminated by a deadly organism found in the black mud of the Everglades. The organism produces an infection called gas gangrene. It can kill a person in just 2 days. Gas gangrene can only be destroyed in a hyperbaric chamber. It's a pressurized container that gets filled with high levels of oxygen. The oxygen gets forced into the wounds and kills the bacteria. 8 of the surviving passengers are infected with gas gangrene. Hyperbaric chambers must be found for all of them. The only other way to save patients is to amputate the infected limb. Ron Infantino's arm is badly infected.
Doctor came in and says, well, we've diagnosed it as gas gangrene. He says, we got to take your arm off immediately or have to get you to a hyperbaric chamber. Unfortunately, he says, the only hyperbaric chamber is at Mercy Hospital, and that's all been taken advantage of.
Unless doctors can find a chamber soon, Infantino will lose his arm. While doctors search for a chamber for Ron Infantino, investigators examine what's left of the plane. They test its flight controls, engines, instruments, and its electrical and hydraulic systems.
The plane was virtually new. It was in perfect condition. There was no mechanical reason found that would have caused the crash.
In fact, some parts of the plane are in such good condition that the NTSB gives them back to Eastern Airlines so they can be installed on other airplanes in its fleet. An unused hyperbaric chamber is finally found for Ron Infantino at a Navy base in Panama City. He spends 40 hours in the chamber. The pressurized oxygen kills the bacteria and saves his life.
Gentlemen, we have 3 causes of the crash to explore.
A state-of-the-art jetliner plunged 2,000 feet without the crew noticing. Investigators know the plane was mechanically sound. They now focus on other possible reasons for the unobserved descent. At the top of the list is subtle incapacitation of the pilot. The autopsy of Captain Bob Loft has yielded a gruesome discovery. Captain Loft had a large, undetected tumor growing in his brain. It pressed into the part of his brain responsible for sight. Medical records reveal that between the ages of 50 and 52, vision in the pilot's left eye had rapidly deteriorated. Doctors believe that the captain may have had reduced peripheral vision. The tumor could have created blind spots. As his attention became focused on the malfunctioning light, he may not have noticed dire warnings on his altimeter. investigators consider a stunning possibility. An undetected medical ailment may have contributed to the world's first jumbo jet disaster.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
Investigators learn what they can about Captain Bob Loft. They interview people who knew him and pore over his medical records.
The investigators heard that Captain Loft, so far as his family and friends knew, had perfect vision. He was an expert marksman. He shot doves, particularly, which are a very small target.
Loft's records show that he'd recently passed a medical in which he was issued corrective glasses for flying. But the evidence doesn't support the notion that his vision was dangerously impaired.
He was 55 years old, and who gets to be 55 without wearing reading glasses? Not many. Dr. Joe Davis, who did the autopsy, told me that even though the tumor was pressing on areas of his brain that control vision, there was no reason to think that it had yet begun to affect those. He felt it had nothing to do with the accident.
Investigators still don't know why Flight 401 started descending in the first place.
Put the autopilot on here.
Could the autopilot, which was supposed to keep the plane at 2,000 feet, have malfunctioned? The plane's computers survived the crash. They're removed and examined. 11 days after the crash, the autopilot computers are installed on another TriStar. It flies the same route as Flight 401. The autopilot holds that plane at 2,000 feet. So why hadn't it on the night of the accident? Investigators will need to explore other leads to find out. There's another question that dogs this investigation. Why didn't the Miami Tower alert the crew that their plane was dropping? The world's first three-dimensional radar had recently been installed there. It meant that controller Charlie Johnson knew the location, altitude, and speed of Flight 401.
National 607 is declaring an emergency.
Investigators study recordings of Johnson's
Runway 9
conversations.
will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
And discover that on the night of the crash, it was another plane that demanded most of his attention. National Airlines Flight 607 was coming into land just ahead of Flight 401. That flight was having its
National
own
607
landing
is
gear
declaring an
problems.
emergency. Runway 9 will need fire and ambulance sent out right away.
As he focused on the emergency, Johnson handed Flight 401 over to another controller. But just as National 607 came in for its emergency landing, the other controller phoned Johnson and handed Flight 401 back to him.
Eastern Heavy's coming back to you. Unsafe nose gear.
No.
At the time, Flight 401 was already over the swamp. Johnson had 5 other planes to monitor. He was also dealing with the aftermath of his emergency landing.
National 607 has landed without incident. Trucks were deployed,
That's when he
but
noticed
they
that
weren't
Flight
used.
401's altitude had dropped to 900 feet.
The way the radars work, still to a certain extent this happens, but back then it was even worse. Coast mode was a very well-known phenomenon. I mean, you might lose the target for 2 or 3 minutes in terms of the altitude reporting part of it, and it goes and gives you some weird altitude, and then boom, it's right back where it should be. But the controller didn't stop there, and this was really to his credit.
Johnson decided to make contact with Flight 401.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in.
Eastern 401, turn left, heading 180.
After that brief exchange, Johnson assumed there was no problem.
Eastern 401, how are things coming along?
Okay,
Investigators conclude that at that moment, Controller Johnson was the only one who could see that the plane was losing altitude. Why hadn't he passed that information along to the crew? US government regulations for air traffic controllers provide the answer. It simply wasn't part of a controller's job.
At the time of the crash, the FAA required approach controllers to maintain a separation of the airplanes. It did not give them a duty to maintain the altitude of the airliner with regard to the ground.
Now investigators try to determine how the plane's own warning system failed to alert pilots to their growing danger. The L-1011 is equipped with an alarm that sounds if the plane goes 250 feet above or below the altitude selected by the pilots. As investigators replay the tape from the black box, they clearly hear that alarm sounding in the cockpit as the plane passed through 1,750 feet.
Did you hear that? How did they miss it?
Investigators closely examine the cockpit transcript to try to understand how the alarm was missed.
Put it in the wrong way, huh?
Swear to me.
Investigators noticed that just before the alarm sounded in the cockpit, warning the crew that the plane is too low, both pilots were completely absorbed with the landing gear light. The conversation also tells investigators that the flight engineer was below in the hellhole. The warning chime came out of a speaker at his workstation. Investigators begin to realize that the two pilots were unable to hear a perfectly audible alarm because they were focused so entirely on solving another problem.
That chime, which is clearly heard on the cockpit voice recorder, was not registering in the minds of all the men on that flight deck. Not because they weren't trying to pay attention, but because they were tunneled in on this one problem. That's what we do as humans.
Investigators now focus on crew distraction as a likely cause of this accident. Several instruments would have displayed the decreasing altitude.
The major question was, why were the pilots so preoccupied that they were not looking at the instrument panel?
They had to look at the human beings. They had to look at the interaction. They had to look at why no one was paying attention to the airplane as it began to creep out of 2,000 feet. That was scary territory in 1972.
Investigators interview a number of pilots and make a startling discovery. Pilots admitted that they placed a lot of trust in the modern new autopilots flying their planes. They may have become overly dependent on the technology.
Put the autopilot on here.
Investigators suspect that the Eastern crew was so confident in their autopilot that they didn't monitor their instruments as closely as they should have.
Now, see if you can get that light out.
Once the autopilot was on, none of the pilots paid attention to actually flying the plane.
Still got to find out why that plane went down.
Investigators still haven't determined the most crucial piece of information. If the autopilot was working, why did the plane dive into the swamp?
We did something to the altitude? What?
The pilot's conversation clearly shows that they hadn't deliberately started descending.
We're still at 2,000, right?
Hey, what's happening here?
So why did it happen? The answer comes in a dramatic form when the NTSB conducts a public hearing in Miami 2 months after the crash. Before the hearing, an Eastern Airlines pilot named Daniel Gellert wrote the chairman of the NTSB offering to testify on his own behalf. He had flown the TriStar L-1011 and noticed some abnormalities.
The world of airline piloting in 1972 was hostile to a pilot going around his chief pilot and his airline and raising his hand to the NTSB and saying, hey, wait a minute, I've had an experience too, because airlines were far more insular than they are today.
Gellert tells the hearing that during a recent flight on a TriStar, he had accidentally dropped a map on the cockpit floor. As he bent down to pick it up, he nudged his control column. He noticed immediately that the plane's autopilot had been affected. The part of the autopilot controlling altitude had been turned off. The NTSB discovers that Gellert's experience is shared by others. In fact, 17 days after the accident, Eastern Airlines tacked a notice onto a company bulletin board and also mailed it to all of its TriStar pilots. The bulletin warned against accidentally bumping the control wheel.
One of the things that we built into all the modern jetliners and airliners is simply a pressure switch. So if you need to take over right now, you don't want to be wasting time down here on the panel turning the autopilot off. You just grab it and the autopilot goes away.
The flight data recorder tells investigators the precise moment that the plane's altitude started to drop. It was 11:37 and 8 seconds. By studying the voice recorder transcript, investigators can tell what was happening in the cockpit at that exact time.
Hey, get down there and see if that damn nose wheel is down.
By turning to speak to the flight engineer, investigators believe that Captain Loft bumped his control wheel. He did it with just enough pressure to disengage that part of the autopilot that had been controlling the plane's altitude. Without anyone realizing it, a simple nudge of the control wheel started a gradual descent. On a dark, moonless night, the pilots had no visual cues to tell them they were falling.
It was determined that occasionally, with just a soft bump, an autopilot had been disengaged.
So before the crash, it wasn't part of the training?
A training director for Eastern Airlines eventually reveals that before the Everglades crash, pilots were never taught that a bump could disengage the autopilot. The NTSB comes to a sobering conclusion. The plane crash was due to pilot error. The crew was distracted. They mishandled the plane's sophisticated automation, and they hadn't been properly trained.
Eastern 401 was a pivotal accident in aviation safety history, and we really didn't know this for about 10 or 15 years in terms of the true import of what it did to us in focusing our attention on the fact that the way we handle things in a cockpit was not only not correct, but it was dangerous.
Investigators also make a disheartening find. When the nose gear indicator light assembly is examined, they discover that a light bulb inside is burnt out.
Go ahead and throw them out.
Flight 401's landing gear was locked. The plane could have landed. The only piece of the plane that failed was a $12 light bulb. The full legacy of Flight 401 will take years to unfold. It will ultimately alter how pilots are trained and how accidents are investigated. But first, the tale of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 will take a very bizarre twist. As far as the NTSB is concerned, the investigation into Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is over. Several recommendations were laid out to prevent similar accidents. Those include new regulations instructing air traffic controllers to warn pilots when they're getting too close to the ground. But 4 years later, it became clear there was a bigger lesson to be learned from Eastern Airlines Flight 401. In 1977, two 747s collided on a runway in Tenerife on the Canary Islands. It was the deadliest plane crash of all time.
And we're now at takeoff. Okay, stand by for takeoff, I will call you. 1736, report when runway clear.
That accident was caused by a string of miscommunications in the cockpit.
Is it not your off now? Is it not your off? They're on American. Yeah, man.
Investigators established that 70% of crashes were due to pilot error.
Both of these accidents, Tenerife and 401, what you see is crews dedicated to doing a good job, but not realizing that they're human, not realizing how many things can go wrong if you don't appreciate how human beings fail.
By the late 1970s, NASA began to explore a new behavioral science designed to reduce pilot error.
And pilots be on the lookout for any different behavior when we acquire.
It's called Crew Resource Management, or CRM.
Crew resource management simply means that we're not going to have one pilot leading and everybody else following. It means that the captain has to be a leader and listen to and interact with his subordinate crew members, and the subordinate crew members have to speak up.
Decades later, Flight 401 is taught in aviation courses around the world as a textbook example of poor CRM.
The problem was that we did not teach Bob Loft or Stockstill or any of these folks at the time that when something goes wrong, the commander's first responsibility is to maintain aircraft control and either do it himself or assign somebody.
We're up to 2,000. You want me to fly, bro?
What frequency did he want us on, Bert?
128.6.
I'll talk to him.
On Flight 401, Captain Loft did not clarify who should be doing what. Instead, all 3 crew members worked on the same problem.
Bob, could you just jiggle the light?
It's gotta come out a little bit and then snap in.
With the co-pilot flying, the captain commanding from the left seat, you already had cross purposes here.
It's right above that red one, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't get at it from here.
And you had a light quadrant the captain couldn't quite reach, and the co-pilot could, but the co-pilot is flying the airplane. You've just set them up for a major problem, and guess what? Systemically, we never taught them what to do.
Today, CRM also trains flight crews not to be intimidated by one crew member's mood.
You got a handkerchief or something so I can get a little better grip on this? Anything I can do it with?
Get down there and see if that damn
This
thing...
won't come out, Bob.
So if the leader is having a problem, in this case with a light bulb,
Okay. You got it sideways now.
and he's really irritated at it, and the co-pilot has now made the problem worse. The co-pilot's not going to be happy with himself over that.
I don't know what the hell's holding that damn thing in there.
Don Repo is not going to be happy that he got downstairs to try to solve the problem, and he couldn't see anything, and he's got to come up and report that.
I don't see it.
They're all tense.
It's not lined up.
I can't see it.
And when you get a crew like that tense, it's not to turn around to the captain and say you shouldn't have done that. But this is part of the evolution of what air safety has now learned and been able to teach so many other industries.
The enduring legacy of Flight 401 is the delegation of specific tasks in the cockpit. The result is fewer crashes. There was also much more bizarre fallout from this crash. It seemed that the crew of Flight 401 was haunting other Eastern Airlines flights. For some time after the crash, flight crews and passengers report seeing lifelike apparitions of Flight 401's crew. Many of the ghost sightings were on aircraft fitted with recovered parts from Flight 401. The ghost stories spread quickly. One book devoted entirely to those stories suggests that the ghosts were there to protect passengers and crew from further mishap.
The official reaction at Eastern Airlines to these ghost stories was one of absolute eye-rolling denial in public, and in private, a certain bit of panic.
There are so many ghost sightings that eventually Eastern Airlines removes Flight 401's cannibalized plane parts from all other aircraft. None of those who survived the crash will ever forget the horror they witnessed in the Everglades that night. And 35 years after their ordeal, many of them returned to that swamp to finally recognize the heroic efforts of Bob Marcus.
They have found
We're here today to recognize and to say thank you.
Many of the ones who lived because Robert Marcus was there with his airboat. He saw them drowning and decided that the thing that he could do would be to save the ones he could save. Robert Marcus was the kind of person that I hope that all of us ultimately would be if we were confronted with that sort of thing, but he drew on some special courage to do what he did. He was one of the true heroes of the crash.